Iran did not lose this war on a battlefield, it lost it in a fuel line. Think about that for a moment. The fourth largest oil producer on Earth, and its own citizens cannot fill their gas tanks. What you are about to hear is not a story about missiles or airstrikes. It is the story of a trap so perfectly constructed that the target had no choice but to walk straight into it and then lock the door behind itself. If this kind of deep dive geopolitical analysis is what you came here for, make sure you hit that like button right now. It tells us to keep making these, and it helps more people find this before the next 14 days run out. The United States did not fire a single shot to bring Iran to this moment. No ground invasion, no air campaign, no dramatic strike on a nuclear facility. Instead, Washington made one surgical move. It parked its navy at the Strait of Hormuz and told the world, everyone goes through except Iran. Saudi tankers, Emirati tankers, Qatari tankers, all moving freely under American naval protection. Iranian oil sealed completely. Every barrel, every dollar, every day. Before the blockade, Iran was generating approximately $150 million in daily oil revenue. That number is now zero, not reduced, zero. Storage tanks are filling to capacity. And here is the detail most analysts are not talking about. When those tanks fill completely, Iran's oil wells do not simply pause. They shut down. And well, shutdowns under these conditions cause geological damage that can take months to reverse and in some cases permanently reduce production capacity. The window before that point of no return is 10 to 14 days. The clock is running right now as you watch this. But here is what makes this blockade historically unlike anything before it. And this is the part that changes everything, so stay with us. The trap was never designed to defeat Iran from the outside. It was designed to make Iran defeat itself from within. And that process is no longer theoretical. It is visible, it is accelerating, and it has produced something that 45 years of sanctions, diplomacy, and military pressure never managed to produce. Iran is splitting in half. There are three distinct power centers inside Iran right now, and they are not negotiating with each other. They are at war with each other. The first is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, led by Commander Ahmad Vahidi, a figure who carries an Interpol notice from Argentina for alleged involvement in international bombings and who was appointed to lead the IRGC under circumstances that reveal everything about where the hardline faction's head is. Vahidi's position is absolute. Escalate, never negotiate, treat any diplomatic outreach as treason. And that position is not just ideologically extreme, it is institutionally necessary. The IRGC controls an estimated 30 to 40% of Iran's domestic economy. Construction companies, telecommunications, oil contracts, banking, ports. It is an economic empire built over 4 decades using the language of revolutionary struggle as justification. Without an active enemy, the questions become impossible to answer. Why does a military organization run banks? Why does it manage airports? Those questions only have defensible answers inside a permanent war narrative. Peace is not a policy option for the IRGC. Peace is an existential threat, but the IRGC's attempt to physically challenge the American blockade lasted 20 minutes. Iranian naval forces moved to contest the American presence and were neutralized without meaningful resistance. Every deterrence capability Iran spent decades building in the Strait, the fast boats, the coastal missiles, the mine-laying operations, was tested against real American naval power and failed catastrophically. And now Vahidi is calling for escalation from inside an organization whose own soldiers have not been paid because the revenue lines that funded their salaries no longer exist. If you are finding this analysis useful, drop a comment below with the word Iran and tell us what you think happens next. The most interesting responses get featured in tomorrow's update. The second power center is the diplomatic wing. President Pezeshkian, Foreign Minister Araghchi, Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf. On April 20th, Pezeshkian made a public statement that landed inside the regime like a grenade. He described $270 billion in war damage. He described currency at historic lows, industrial zones struck, port infrastructure degraded, energy supplies cut. And then he said something that no senior Iranian official has said publicly in 45 years of this regime. The truth must be told to the people, otherwise trust in government will completely erode. For the hardliners, that sentence was not a policy disagreement. It was a declaration of sides. Ghalibaf went further in a private meeting reported by Iran International. The Speaker of Iran's parliament described senior IRGC-aligned figures as extreme militia-like actors who will destroy Iran. He expressed fear of being removed from his own position. The head of Iran's legislature is afraid of the organization he is supposed to help govern. And Araghchi, the foreign minister, announced on April 17th that the Strait was open to all commercial vessels, attempting to signal diplomatic flexibility to international partners. The IRGC opened fire on tankers the same day. State television called Araghchi stupid, by name, on air. A country's foreign minister publicly humiliated by his own military's media while conducting official diplomacy is not a government experiencing internal tension. It is a government that has stopped functioning as a single entity. The third power center has no office and no press releases. It stands in fuel lines. It shuts shops with empty shelves. It drives trucks stopped on highways because diesel is unavailable. It chants death to the dictator in Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, and dozens of other cities simultaneously. In 2009, the uprising was concentrated in Tehran. In 2019, it was triggered by a fuel price shock in specific cities. Now protests are erupting across dozens of cities at once, from major urban centers to provincial towns that never appeared in previous protest waves. The IRGC's suppression model was built to crush concentrated urban unrest, flood one city with forces, restore order, manage the aftermath. That model is breaking against geography it was never designed to handle. While it crushes one city, another ignites. The IRGC is being asked to fight a war it is losing, manage an internal political fracture, pay soldiers it cannot afford, and suppress the widest geographically distributed uprising it has ever faced, simultaneously. It cannot do all four, and the one it is prioritizing, the war machine, is accelerating the other three. Here is the structural collapse that no state television broadcast has acknowledged, and it may be the most alarming development in this entire crisis. Iran has two armies. They have despised each other since 1979. Artesh is the conventional military, inherited from the Shah era, filled through mandatory conscription, whose institutional identity predates the revolution entirely. The IRGC was created precisely because the regime did not trust Artesh. For 45 years, Revolutionary Guards officers received the best weapons, best salaries, best hospitals, privileged access to commercial contracts that made them wealthy in ways their Artesh counterparts cannot approach. Artesh soldiers were treated as second class within their own country's military, drafted into service for a revolution they did not choose, compensated accordingly. That resentment has now reached a breaking point visible to every soldier in both forces. Frontline Artesh units suffering significant casualties requested medical evacuation from IRGC forces operating in the same theater. The IRGC refused, citing ambulance shortages and blood supply constraints. Revolutionary Guard personnel declined to transport wounded Artesh soldiers to IRGC medical facilities. Iranian soldiers are dying of treatable wounds. Their countrymen in better equipped units are watching them die and citing logistics. That is not military stress. That is two armed forces that have become enemies while wearing the uniforms of the same country. The material situation confirms the depth of the collapse. Some frontline units are being issued 20 rounds of ammunition for every 2 soldiers. An automatic weapon fires 10 rounds per second. The combined firepower of 2 soldiers lasts 2 seconds of sustained fire. Units are operating without reliable access to drinking water or adequate food. The IRGC's missile units, the crown jewels of the Iranian military, are experiencing communication failures and supply shortages. Command response to this has been revealing. Technical components for missile systems are being delivered. Food for the soldiers operating those systems is not. The machine must function. The soldiers can go hungry. The predictable result is mass desertion, not individual soldiers slipping away in the night, groups, formations. Soldiers abandoning bases and seeking refuge in nearby towns in numbers large enough to constitute a military phenomenon rather than a discipline problem. Reserve mobilization was attempted to replace the losses. Informed sources described the result as a complete fiasco. Most called up did not report. Some used the mobilization order as a signal to move their families toward border regions. When a country's military draft order accelerates civilian evacuation, the state's authority over its own population has reached a threshold from which recovery is not straightforward, and the chants rising from protest crowds in multiple cities, "The army is with the people," are not simply expressions of hope. They are direct communication to Artesh commanders, an invitation, the civilian population asking the conventional military, the one the regime never trusted, the one treated as second class for 4 decades, the one whose wounded are being left to die, to make a choice. That question, once asked loudly enough and geographically widely enough, cannot be unasked. Every Artesh commander hearing those chants is running a calculation the regime cannot monitor or control. If that calculation shifts, if enough conventional military officers decide the regime's survival is not worth their lives, the entire suppression architecture collapses simultaneously. Outside Iran's borders, the isolation has reached a point that would have been unimaginable 3 months ago. China, which purchased 90% of Iran's oil exports, which signed a 25-year strategic partnership with Tehran promising hundreds of billions in investment, has gone quiet. Not supportive, quiet. Xi Jinping's phone calls went to Riyadh, not Tehran. Beijing's foreign ministry statements prioritize Hormuz remaining open as an international waterway. Chinese ships have been struck by the same IRGC forces that China's partnership was supposed to align with. China is not saving Iran. It is calculating whether Iran's further weakening serves Chinese interests better than Iranian stabilization does. Russia's position is colder still beneath the surface solidarity. Foreign Minister Lavrov condemned the American blockade as unlawful at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, and then, in the same forum, on the same day, announced that Russia is ready to supply energy resources to China and other countries affected by the crisis. Russia is advertising its readiness to replace Iranian oil in Chinese markets while performing solidarity with the country whose market share it is preparing to capture. Every barrel Iran cannot export is a barrel Russia can sell. Russia's support for Iran is the support of a competitor who needs the partnership narrative while profiting from the partner's collapse. The proxy network that represented 40 years of Iranian regional power is evaporating alongside the financial flows that sustained it. Hezbollah's senior command structure has been systematically dismantled. Hamas has been crushed in Gaza. The Houthis are in direct naval combat with American forces and calculating whether continued escalation saves Tehran or accelerates an Israeli-American strike on their own positions. Iraqi militias are retreating under pressure from Baghdad. Every organization inside the axis of resistance watched the IRGC fail in 20 minutes in its own territorial waters and drew the same conclusion. If Tehran cannot protect its own strait, it cannot protect anyone. If Iran cannot guarantee security, the logic of dying for Tehran collapses. The 40-year project of regional power projection built through proxy networks and resistance ideology was sustained not by military capability alone, but by the perception that the center could hold. That perception is gone, and broken perception cannot be rebuilt with money that no longer exists. Meanwhile, the supreme leader, the man constitutionally required to authorize any major decision, is reportedly in a coma. The governance approvals being obtained from his intensive care room are the constitutional fiction on which whatever remains of Iranian decision-making is currently operating. 4 men shaped by the revolutionary era of 1988, knowing each other's files, carrying each other's secrets, settling 40 years of personal scores, are now making existential choices about a nuclear armed state's future under conditions of zero financial runway, internal military collapse, and a popular uprising that is losing patience faster than the oil storage tanks are filling. The United States engineered conditions in which every Iranian faction's survival strategy requires defeating the other factions before the clock runs out, while ensuring there is not enough time for any faction to decisively win before the situation becomes irreversible. The IRGC's war doctrine is financially unsustainable, while that same doctrine destroys the diplomatic options that could relieve the financial pressure. The regime's social contract with its population is impossible to maintain, while the internal conflict prevents the decisions that could restore it. This is not conventional military victory. It is something more precise and more complete, a strategic architecture designed to make the target dismantle itself. But here is what Washington is watching most anxiously, and this is the detail that should concern everyone watching this situation. A cornered regime does not always play rationally. A military faction that has identified its own institutional survival as separate from the country's survival, that is watching its economic empire shrink, its proxy networks evaporate, and its own personnel abandon their posts, does not always choose the option that minimizes damage. Sometimes it chooses the option that maximizes chaos. Because in chaos, the IRGC retains the suppression capacity that gives it relevance. In chaos, the civilian population is too frightened to protest. In chaos, the diplomatic faction has nothing stable enough to negotiate around. Vahidi's calculation may not be save Iran. It may be survive the collapse by controlling the collapse. And that calculation, applied by a man with his personal history, commanding an organization with its institutional structure inside a country with nuclear capabilities, is what keeps American analysts watching every signal from Tehran with the kind of attention that only the most dangerous possible scenarios generate. The streets are burning, the soldiers are deserting, the wells are filling, the diplomats are terrified, the generals are firing on tankers while the foreign minister announces peace. And the man who was supposed to make the final call cannot open his eyes. 10 to 14 days. That is how long the geological clock gives this regime before the wells begin shutting down, before damage becomes permanent, before the leverage in any future deal degrades beyond recovery. Every day that passes without a resolution, the cost of a settlement gets worse, which shrinks the space in which a deal is viable, which extends the blockade, which runs the clock further. This situation is evolving daily. If you want to understand what actually happens next, not the headlines, the mechanics, subscribe now. We break down what the news skips over every single day. And if you have been watching this unfold, share this with someone who needs to understand why Iran is not just losing a standoff, it is losing itself.